Hello and welcome to Chillers and Thrillers Extras, special episode just for my YouTube subscribers. Before we get started, please remember to like this video, share with your friends, and subscribe to the channel. I'd like to apologize for some of the sound issues I've experienced from the last bit of the second story into the third story. I tried my best to edit it, so my apologies. Now, get comfortable, turn down the lights, and listen in. The Ramshackle House, submitted by Mermsy_Ruffles. My senior year of college, I rented a ramshackle off-campus house with 4 friends. Our landlord had bought the house for his daughter while she was in college, but completely neglected it after her graduation, even though he was renting it out. When we arrived during the last days of the summer, we were met with a disgusting house that was littered with thousands of flies, dead mice, and what we believed was a mummified rat in the trash. With no other options for housing, we decided to roll up our sleeves, clean it out, and get on with the year. It was a very long and tumultuous year, and for the record, I 100% blamed the house. Stuff was always going wrong in the house. We had a fire in the garage. We had mice and rats that frequently died in one particular roommate's walls. My bedroom was always cold, and any space heater set up would just blow the fuse. Everyone in the house constantly fought, even though we got along great prior. Granted, any of these things on their own could be chalked up to bad luck, or just run-of-the-mill life happens stuff. But added all together, it was a year of misery we just couldn't escape. Everyone's personal lives suffered as well. One roommate suffered a spontaneous, debilitating medical episode. Another's relationship with her mom crumbled violently. Another's father died. About 4 months in, we began to experience actual, unexplainable events. By this time, my other 3 roommates rarely spent time at the house. But my roommate Sarah, her boyfriend, and myself became the steady target for every weird or creepy episode. Sarah and her boyfriend were constantly jabbed and poked in her room or brushed against in the hall. We always kept the lights on because the shadows in the house were bizarrely intimidating. I could hear quiet scratching and skittering in my room frequently. I would usually brush it off as a mouse in the wall, but one night, I was so sure there must have been a large rat under my bed. I flipped on the light and pulled the room apart to find nothing. After that, I slept with music and a fan on. In one incident, I was running my finger of a wine glass, making it sing. When I stopped, I heard a singing glass reply. I called out to my roommate to see if she was doing it, but she confirmed she hadn't. With her in the room and no one else in the house, I tried again, and we both heard a second reply. Neither of us can come up with any explanation for how this happened. Our mental health was clearly suffering. One night, I realized I was just standing in a field on the other side of campus. I don't remember putting on my winter gear and getting in my car and driving there, but apparently I did. Regardless of how many odd things that happened, I usually just told myself it was stress. It really felt like I was losing my mind. The final incident happened shortly before graduation. I was snoozing, half awake in my bed on a Saturday morning around 8 or 9 a.m. when I felt a hand press my face into my pillow. The hand had the definition of a thumb heel, an index finger, but no heat or warmth. I didn't dare open my eyes, but for several seconds I felt a weight push on my cheek, then slowly release. I know positively that no one else was in my room. No one opened my door or shut it. Whatever it was not a person. Luckily, we moved out not long after, but it felt like a hurricane had gone off in my life. It took a long time to recover from whatever that was while we were living there. The House I Grew Up In, submitted by user T-Night. I have 3 stories, and all of them have to do with the house I grew up in. I grew up in a house in a Midwestern town of about 15,000 people that was built in 1916 by a wealthy local business owner for his 3 daughters to live in. None of them ever married, and they lived there all their lives. He also eventually built the larger, grander house directly across the street from ours for himself. From what I can tell, based on its history, the house I grew up in has always been odd. It has a bad feeling to it, and it is also surprisingly dark inside, even on very sunny days. It seems to attract misfortune, and every group of people who has lived in the house, including the sisters, who we will call the W sisters, has had at least one person die in the house. I noticed the pattern when I was in grade school and mentioned it to my mother and stepfather, who explained that it wasn't unusual to die at home in the old days, so it wasn't that strange considering. Then, of course, it happened to us. My stepfather had lived on the other end of the block from this house his entire life, and had become determined as a young boy that he would buy it one day and live there. He could never adequately explain why. The house just called to him. He bought it for nothing in the 1970s after it was left unheated over the winter by an owner who was trying to sell, and the pipes burst in many of the walls, causing a lot of damage. He fixed it up and lived there with his wife and 3 children. Eventually, he got divorced, but his one condition was that he would get to keep the house. Some years later, he met and married my mother, and we moved into the house when I was 3. When I was 10, he committed suicide in the basement. In his will, he left my mother the house. For reasons she has never been able to explain to me, she decided to stay. She lives in the house to this day. My stepfather suffered from severe depression all his life and refused therapy. I know, technically, that his illness killed him, but I also think the house made things worse. The upstairs of the house had undergone extensive remodeling in its first 100 years. There used to be only one bedroom on the left side of the landing at the top of the stairs. My childhood room got built out over the kitchen in the 1980s as a mirror image of that room, more or less. Thus, my room was the newest in the house, and I always understood it to be safe. Almost nothing strange ever happened in it. Down the hall from the original bedroom was what used to be the attic, blocked off with a wooden door that has since been removed. Although the door frame remains, the attic occupied the front half of the upstairs, but in the 1930s, one bedroom was added in what was formerly the attic space. Thus, the upstairs bedroom is as far as you can go across the upstairs from my old room. This area was not considered safe. One night, I got up to use the bathroom upstairs, which I almost never did. I was often scolded by my mother and stepfather, who slept downstairs, for running down the upstairs hallway back to my room. My explanations about a bad, watching feeling in the front half of the upstairs were ignored or dismissed, which is strange given my 3rd story below, but we'll get there. At any rate, that night, for whatever reason, I ended up going to the bathroom sometime after 11 p.m. I walked through the door frame where the attic door used to be and put out my right hand to turn on the light switch. There's a room of sorts there where the 2 bedroom doors, the bathroom door, and the hallway all meet. And I usually turn on both and the bathroom light because if you turn on one, it had a nasty habit of going out. I reached out in the dark, and the wall wasn't there. Instead, my hand passed through the space where the wall should have been, and I touched a person. I felt heavy fabrics like satin, and under that, someone's chest, as though I had reached out and given someone a firm prod on their rib cage. I could clearly feel clothing, and under that, flesh and the bones of a person's rib cage, as though I'd poked them over their heart. I yanked my hand back, so shocked I wasn't thinking anything at all. Then, for reasons I still don't understand, reached out again to try and turn on the light. The wall was back, the light came on without incident, and there was nothing and no one there. My last incident I call the Ash Grove. When I was very small, my mother used to sing to me before bed. She had a set repertoire of half a dozen or so songs, mostly folk songs and similar, and I knew all of them by heart. We used to sing them together. This stopped around the time I got to first grade and would rather read at night than sing. After my stepfather passed, it was just her and me in the house. I was homesick from school one day when I was about 11 or 12. Mom had gone out to the grocery store and I was bored and alone, laying in bed in my room. I was just sick enough to stay home, but not so sick that all I wanted to do was sleep. To pass the time while she was gone, I tried to remember and sing all the songs she used to sing to me when I was little. I started with the Ash Grove. The song is incredibly old, and there are millions of versions, but this is the one I know. The ash grove, how graceful, how plainly 'tis speaking. The wind through it playing has language for me. Where are its branches the sunlight is breaking. A host of kind faces is gazing on me. And then someone in the house sang back, in a woman's voice. The friends of my childhood again are before me. Each step makes a memory as freely as I roam. With soft whispers laden, it leaves rustle o'er me, the ash grove, alone in my home. For a minute, I thought my mom had come home, and I laid there for probably 15 or more minutes, waiting for her to come in and say hi and check on me. And it was about then that the back door opened, and she actually came home. A certain level of inexplicable goings-on was a normal feature of life in that house, at least since my stepfather had moved in the 70s. Apparently things were even wilder before he started remodeling. Prior to redoing the home, full-bodied apparitions of at least one of the W sisters weren't particularly unusual. Catherine W. in particular he saw regularly, easily identifiable by her distinctive hairstyle. She also died in the home. My last story I called The Storm. When I was 6 or 7, on the night of an event I've come to think of the storm, somehow I managed to sleep through the whole thing. So this story is about my mother and stepfather based on what my mother told me the next day and in the years following before she stopped talking about it. I was asleep in my bed upstairs and my parents were asleep in their bedroom downstairs. Both of them were awakened after 2 a.m. by the distinct sound of voices coming from upstairs. 2 men talking. No one else was in the house, just the 3 of us, and the doors were locked. They stayed in bed for a couple of minutes listening. The voices were coming from the 1930s add-on bedroom in the former attic upstairs, and they were getting louder and more agitated. Finally, one of the men began to cry out in pain and shout that he was going home, followed by a woman's name. There was a lot of banging and thumping. My stepfather jumped out of bed at my mother's urging and tried to go upstairs. He couldn't. Some force or other invisible obstacle physically kept him from going up the stairs, let alone walking down the upstairs hall and into that bedroom. The yelling and banging sounds went on for about another minute. It was as though an invisible storm was taking place in the house. Then everything went quiet. The obstacle vanished, and he was able to go upstairs and check on things. Everything was fine. I was somehow still asleep, although all this would have taken place right on the other side of my bedroom wall, and nothing was out of place in that upstairs bedroom. My mother and stepfather, understandably shaken, talked to some of the older residents in our neighborhood, trying to find out what they had heard. And here's where it gets really strange. At least one of the voices they heard couldn't have been a ghost, because that person was still alive. He had been born in 1919. He lived across the street in the W father sister's old house. His name was Dr. K, and he was able to tell my mother exactly what she had heard, because he had been there the night of the real incident. Dr. K had been in medicine for many years and was the town doctor, meaning that in the old days he made house calls. As a very young man, he had been called to the sister's house, which at the time was a boarding house. The room upstairs, including the room added during the Depression, were rented out. One of the renters was in the room and was dying. He was upset and agitated, and Dr. K was trying to calm him down. And at the very end, he started to yell that he was going home and calling out a woman's name. Then he died. People ask me if my childhood home is haunted. I don't know how to answer that question. I know that it's not a nice place. To this day, I get a bad feeling whenever I'm there visiting my mother, especially in the front half of the upstairs. I hate the bedrooms and I refuse to be in them alone for any length of time. The feeling of watching is oppressive. If I had to describe it, I'd say that the house echoes. Bad things that happen there keep repeating and coming back. The Masks, submitted by user Morgala. When I was in grade school, we lived in a tiny cottage built in the 1940s. My mother was an artist and tutored students at her house. She also had a lot of college-aged artsy friends who would come over and hang out. This was also the 1970s, so there was no doubt a lot of partying. So if I hadn't been a witness to this event, I would have probably thought it was the result of too much drinking. One of the fun things they did together was make life masks, which required the subject to lie on the floor with straws up their nose and Vaseline on their skin, so a cast could be made of their face. Pretty much all of the circle of friends, plus my mom and dad, had these made. My mom hung them in a line over the windows in our den where our TV was. This might have seemed really creepy to a normal person, watching TV with a bunch of disembodied white plaster faces just staring down from the wall, but Mom painted surreal and gothic subjects, and my dad paraphrased H.P. Lovecraft tales to me at bedtime. So it wasn't creepy to me at all, just normal. Now our TV room where the masks were pretty tiny, and laid out in such a way as to have one door behind the couch that led to the hall where the bedrooms were, and another door to the right of the couch that led to the kitchen dining area. In the kitchen was a door that led out to the backyard, and also one that opened to the garage. This is important because my dad worked late a lot and my mom was super paranoid about weirdos getting in since we lived near a fairground and homeless people wandered by pretty regularly. So she always locked all the outside doors with a deadbolt and chain before putting me to bed. I remember watching TV, that it was supposed to be time for me to go to bed. Dad was working late as usual, and my mom had a friend over. They were talking all about this friend's upcoming wedding, which was about to bore me to sleep in any case, so I went to my room without being asked. I had already seen my mom go around and do her door locking ritual, and she and her friend got drinks, then went to the TV room and closed both doors. I could hear them talking and the TV murmuring in the background. Our house was pretty small and noises carried. I got a book and started reading. It wasn't very long before I heard a loud, steady knocking. It didn't seem to be coming from the front door, so I assumed that another friend had showed up and they were knocking rather than ringing the bell. I could hear my mom and her friend moving around, opening a door, and my mom stuck her head around the corner of the hall as she went to the front door. Her friend yelled out, "There's nobody here, the door's locked." No one at the front door either. Obviously, his mom came into the hall again before opening the door across from mine that led to the TV room. All of this happened in about a minute. My mom started screaming. I jumped up and ran to her side to hold her hand. It terrified me to hear her so frightened. Her friend ran into the room and said, "What? What's wrong?" And my mom pointed to the masks. They were hung too high to reach without a stepladder, but someone had obviously been messing with them. Several had marks across the faces. Greasy, black, sooty smears. One on the end had a black thumbprint-sized mark in the middle of the forehead. "Did you do this?" my mom accused her friend. How could I? I was with you checking the locks. I could tell there was no way either of them had a clue what was going on. Then they both proceeded to freak out over the knocking that had come from the door inside the house, the one leading to the kitchen from the TV room. After they had heard 3 knocks, my mom had leaned over and opened the door. Upon seeing that there was no one there, her first reaction was to check to see if it was me, then check the front door, while her friend checked the back and garage doors. Both of them assumed there must have been someone in the house. Obviously, they thought that person got inside but was locked in. And now that person had vandalized the masks in a very creepy manner, like they had been marked for death by some sooty demon finger. My mom grabbed me and some clothes, and we got the heck out of there to stay over at my grandma's house. She paused long enough to scribble a note to my dad, then left. My mom's friend and her got together the next day to try to figure things out. They were both artists and could tell the black smudges were not from any paint. It was like they were burned into the plaster. My dad's mask hadn't been touched. He had refused to let my mom hang it in the first place. My mom's friend's mask was fine too, but my mom's wasn't. She didn't notice until the next day, because it was marked on the back, not across the face. It looked like a splatter of black acid burns was all over it. My mom took the masks down and painted all over the ones that had been marked. When I got older, I wanted her to make a mask of my face, and she refused. 2 years after the mask incident, the girl whose mask had the stripe across the eye and cheek was in a car accident and almost lost an eye. That same year, the person who had the black thumbprint died. One mask had been marked across the mouth. That woman is still an alcoholic. My mother died of rapidly advancing cancer. My dad and the friend who hadn't been marked are both still alive and well. The other 2 unmarked masks were from people I understand are still living, but I am not sure of their health. If it was a prank, it was one my mom and her friend never figured out. I had the mask of my mom's friend hanging in the hall above my stairs. That's all for this episode. Season 3 comes back on August 15th. And in the meantime, I hope all you ghouls and ghosts stay safe.